on. You can plug in your questions there, and we will get them here on our phone and get to as many of them as possible. But the thrust of today's conversation is analyzing President Biden's first 100 days. And I can tell you, leading the nation's largest public policy group outside DC, that we don't engage much, hopefully at all, in hyperbole. But the following is true. This is the worst first 100 days of any presidential administration in history. Let me just read some things that Vance and Ken may not mention, just to put this in perspective. This is a parade of horribles just of the last several days. The Biden administration continued to convey weakness in light of the Palestinian Authority showering rockets into Israel. They still have not rhetorically defended Israel. They revoked the requirement that immigrants demonstrate that they will not be a financial burden to the U.S. healthcare system. They repealed the clarification that Section 230 liability protections for tech companies should be narrowly interpreted and are in need of some sort of reform. They repealed additional protections for America's statues, monuments, and memorials. They terminated the task force on building and rebuilding monuments to American heroes. They revoked the requirement to more consistently and conspicuously identify U.S. taxpayer foreign assistance as American aid. And they terminated the very controversial National Garden of American Heroes. The point is, my friends, this administration is off to a great start if you're a radical leftist. But whether we take that list or what Vance is going to talk about the economy, or what Ken is going to talk about regarding the border crisis, this administration, just 100 days in, is already in need of reform. So Dr. Vance Ginn, we're going to start with you, the proverbial 30,000-foot question. What's going on with the American economy under the Biden and Harris administration?
Well, Kevin, it's always a pleasure to be with you. And I think the list that you went through right there starts a lot of this, what's going on here. And it's tantamount to the amount of disaster that we're seeing, one after another. And it's unfortunate overall. You know, one of the things that was tweeted out this morning was by Jared Bernstein, who's one of the top economists at the Council of Economic Advisors to the president. And he talks about how many more people are getting welfare checks and safety net programs and things of that nature. It says this is Bidenomics. Heads down, block out the noise, deliver timely help to the American people. When I read that, it really does tell me a lot about what Bidenomics is about. It's head down no matter what basic economics tells you, right? It's handouts overall to people so that they can be on welfare instead of work. And it's about a timely sort of program that they're trying to put resources out there, but even some of their earned income tax credits that are going out aren't until July. That's not timely and targeted and temporary.
A new threshold for heads down.
Yeah, heads down, exactly. Like kind of like the ostrich. Let's put our heads down in the sand and not look at all the evidence, whether they be the history, which you're well versed in.
Of certain partiality.
Just a little bit there, yeah. Or what the actual evidence is that we're seeing today. So when I think about the failure of the Bidenomics, if you will, the Biden administration so far in just the first 100 days, I think about fiscal and monetary policy, where you've either had $6 trillion of new spending over the next decade that they put either passed or have proposed. And it's actually well more than that, but just say $6 trillion. The amount of Federal Reserve action that's put in place of also printing money, putting more money into our system, too much money chasing too few goods. What does that result in? Inflation, which we're seeing. We're also seeing many people are choosing more leisure, staying home and on the couch versus going and get a job because of the handouts that are being provided. We could talk about some more of those details. I think that's the second one. Labor and inflation are peaking up everywhere around us in the sense that labor, no one's wanting to work. Mm-hmm. We have massive number of job openings, 8.1 million job openings across the United States. And that's not because of what we were doing under the Trump administration, where I was the chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget and pro-growth policies. This is where people just don't want to go back to work. And that is an unfortunate situation. And really the third thing is state sovereignty. They are making states more dependent on the actions of the federal government, from their American Rescue Plan Act, which basically says you can't cut taxes for the next 4 years if you use these monies. And so I think these are all big issues that we need to discuss and really look at the failures, because what we hope to do, as you always call us happy warriors here, is find a good path forward. We know what works. We know it's a pro-growth policy of deregulation, tax cuts, and spending restraint that was under the Trump administration overall, to where we had the lowest poverty on record and the highest real household incomes that we have also had on record. That's what we need to get back to.
Well, you set the table, as you always do, very well, Vance, for a lot of follow-up questions, and I'll come back to that. But I might summarize this way, and this is anecdotal, so pardon me, but the data, as you will show, will bear this out in the aggregate. The two most frequent complaints I've heard from people here in the Austin area, Central Texas, including parts of rural Texas, are number one, when these people saying, number one, when they go to a restaurant, there aren't enough employees there to staff the restaurant. That's connected to what you just said. And number two, sometimes it's number one, but it is mentioned, top two, Ken Oliver, is what in the world is going on at the border. By the end of the conversation today, we're going to show you how those two things are connected, but let's first give you a few minutes here, Ken, to answer your proverbial 30,000-foot question, which is, tell us about the border crisis.
Well, the Biden administration inherited a situation under control. There's absolutely all that's going on is exactly the result of what the Biden administration has done. They started out by saying, we will suspend Title 42, the public health restrictions on young people, on minors. That explains why we have record numbers of minors coming in from all over the world, not just Central America. Secondly, the Biden administration also stopped the migrant protection protocols, which the Trump administration finally put into place 2 years ago, threatening tariffs on Mexico to do it. But that is what held back this massive abuse of the asylum system, which is the root cause of this massive problem we have. We had last month 178,000 apprehensions on our border. That follows the previous month, 170,000, with no end in sight, Kevin, because this administration refuses to recognize that most of the people coming here do not have a legitimate asylum claim, have no right to come in and stay in shelters in the case of the minors, where many are being subject to abuse, and possibly, in addition to that, are coming from countries where the vaccination rates are 1% to 2%. They're just barely beginning to vaccinate people in Guatemala and Honduras, for example. And those are the elderly. The elderly are not the ones coming. Mm-hmm. And we ourselves, just a few months ago, were on the border with our Texas delegation, seeing this tragedy of human trafficking up front. And it's just exactly what we've seen, Kevin, is that the Biden administration did exactly what the human smugglers wanted them to do to get people to come into this country.
Well, Ken, you, like Vance, set the table for a lot of questions that I probably won't have time to ask. Maybe some members of our audience will. I want to ask you a quick follow-up question. And it seems like this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but it's really important for all of you to hear Ken, who is an expert, explain this. And that is, you mentioned the abuse of the asylum system. If I'm tuning in out there today, and maybe I'm more in the center than I am on the right, I might think, well, asylum, this is America. This sounds like a place where maybe someone seeking asylum should be able to come. I think the three of us would agree with that statement, but the abuse of the asylum system is the problem. Explain that.
Yeah, this is where we've really focused as a foundation, where we really need to call this area, which is that asylum was built after World War II, basically for Holocaust and communist victims who were suffering under communism and Nazism because of their religious beliefs and their political beliefs, their beliefs in democracy. It was not meant for minors suffering from gang violence, or adults for that matter, suffering from generalized crime in their country. So the asylum, unfortunately, is being abused because this administration is letting people make these claims of fear of return based on that my country is dangerous, when it's not the country itself which is persecuting them. Their country is struggling, yes, as we are in many of our cities with crime. But that is not a basis for legitimate asylum. And unfortunately, this administration refuses to recognize that they are opening the gates to false and frivolous asylum claims. And eventually about 80% of these cases where they say there's a fear of return, those claims, 80% or more, are totally found not to be valid.
Well, that's a huge problem we got to fix on the public policy side of the equation. And we'll get to solutions, we promise, but unfortunately, there are a lot of problems to talk about, Vance. And one of them, and in ways connected to what Ken just said that we'll explain, one of them is just getting people back to work. And so you were able to explain a lot of data in your first response. And I'm hopeful that you can walk us through the 2 or 3 most salient numbers, 2 or 3 most salient pieces of data for someone tuning in to understand this economy ought to be roaring, and this economy is beginning to sputter with not just the threat, but the reality of inflation setting in. This is going to be a really ugly picture, but it's important to understand so that we can get to some optimistic Vance Ginn solutions.
That's right. Well, I think the first thing I would think about is the jobs report that just came out a little over a week ago. There was expected to be about 1 million jobs that were created across the economy, and the number was just north of 200,000. Right. It's just a dreadful sort of jobs report compared to overall. And when you look at just the private sector alone, we're still 7 million jobs below where we were in February of 2020. We lost 21 million jobs over those two months, right, of March and April of last year. It's terrific. We've gained 14.4 million. A lot of those were during the Trump administration. And so what we've seen now is a slowdown in job creation at a time when we still have many people who are on the sidelines. And I think that is a product of the policies that have been put in place. And along with that, we're also starting to see some slower economic growth. And if you have an increase in the money supply, I was just looking at this earlier, the money supply is up about more than 300%. More than 300%. You have the Federal Reserve's balance sheet that has doubled over the last year, and you have the velocity of money, not to get into too many of the details, but the velocity of money is down 80%. So
the velocity of
money.
I know
how fast the money is changing hands.
Okay.
Right. So if you have more money that's out in the economy, but there's demand for it, you won't see a lot of inflation. Okay. Well, money supply is up 300%, velocity is down only 80%. So that's either got to go into more GDP growth, more economic output, or more inflation. Well, we're not seeing the economic output grow at that same rate. We are seeing inflation start to pick up. The latest numbers of CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is a basket of what the typical household in the urban areas buy, shows it was up 4.1% year over year. That's just a start to this. And it's not just this basket, which a typical household buys. When you go to the gas station is, gas prices are through the roof. Some of that's on this East Coast issue, which is a whole other thing I think you could talk about the Biden administration on.
That's true Russian collusion, right?
Yeah, right. And then you also see lumber prices through the roof, housing prices, the stock market. I mean, I think it's not just this basket where some economists would say there's not any inflation in the economy. What I want to look at is what people are actually paying for and where they see these prices start to come about. And those are everywhere. We are seeing inflation because too much money is chasing too few goods, and a lot of the goods on the supply side is being held back. Why would you want to start a business right now if your tax rates are going to go up to 39%? Or why would you want to have capital gains if it's going to go up to 40%? The corporate income tax rate could go from 21% to 28%. If you add in the state levels, we're almost at 50%. And businesses don't pay taxes. They submit taxes, but we all pay for them through the form of higher prices, lower wages, and fewer jobs available. So when I look at the economy, I see so much restraint on the supply side, not allowing for more production and economic growth and job creation. And I see a lot of movement on the demand side, handouts, quote unquote, stimulus checks and things of that nature, unemployment benefits that are $300 a week. It's $15,000 a year. And here in Texas, you also add in the $500 a week you can make $40,000 a year just on unemployment insurance. Many states, almost 20 states now have said, you know what, we're going to cut back that $300 a week. And I hope Texas does here soon, because we really need to get people back into the workforce, and that will allow us to have more economic growth. So I do think there are some dire things here that we've got to consider on the economic front, because if not, maybe some more people that's coming over from south of the border are just going to start filling those jobs.
Yeah. And so the headline I would write is, as we begin our pivot to some solutions, is that the time is now to reverse course. Mm-hmm. We don't have time on inflation or some of the other measures of economic health to wait until December of this year or next year. We really do need to change course. One of the ways that the president and his party decided they would attack this problem is by sending another couple $1 trillion of relief funds to the states. We can say, Vance, you and I, because we've met with leadership of the Texas legislature on this, Texas legislators don't want that money, or at least most of that money. We've decided, the three of us were sitting around the virtual water cooler one day, that one of the ways you could put that relief money to good use is on solving the border crisis. And so, Ken, why don't you lay that out? This is solution number one. among some solutions we're going to suggest?
Sure. Well, we have over, as Vance has indicated, we have, $30 billion coming in. Many of it is restricted, or much of it is restricted, but some is for infrastructure, which the state could use. Now, the Treasury Department a week ago or so gave regulations that indicated we can't use that for border wall. Now, unfortunately, in the case of the border wall, most of the construction under the Trump administration took place in areas outside of the epicenter of our current crisis, which is Laredo and the Rio Grande Valley. That's where we really need the construction to continue. And in fact, the Biden administration is finally beginning to fill some of those gaps and really a vindication for the Trump administration policy. But we feel that Texas is in a position at some point to, whether through a lawsuit against the Biden administration, again, to fail to uphold its responsibility to secure the border, we do need to proceed with construction of border wall, because we have not only the problem of illegal immigration and abuse of the asylum system, but we have drugs pouring into the country. Our federal officers are overwhelmed taking care of minors, and there's so many people that also are getting away from our officers. In addition, the smugglers use that to get the drugs into the country.
Mm-hmm. So there's solution one. Let's take some of these funds, and Texas can finish the border wall. In fact, we're reminded by some friends who are in the Trump administration, there are 280,000 tons of steel bollards that are ready to be erected as part of the wall system that we're paying rent on, which makes no sense. Vance, I'm going to pitch one more question to you, and then we're going to turn to the audience for questions. We already have some of you who have submitted questions. If you haven't yet and you want to, just type that into the social media channel on which you are viewing today's program. Vance, top lines, 2, 3, 4 solutions that will reverse course on the economy.
I think the number one, well, one of the number one things would be to say we're not going to raise taxes. Mm-hmm. Taxes should be off the table because there are substantial tax increases in these next couple of plans that are coming down the road. The next one they have is the American Relief Plan. They're great the left is great at calling these things.
They call them great names that do nothing.
That's right. That's right. The next one was the American Jobs Plan, which I really think is more of an American anti-jobs plan and a green energy boondoggle along the way. And then the last one is called the American Families Plan, which actually is the anti-family plan. It's really the increased dependency of families on the federal government. And that is not the direction we should be heading. And so I think that we should be not talking about any sort of increases in taxes. That's going to reduce economic growth overall, and not start rolling back a lot of the deregulation that the Trump administration did that started to unleash economic prosperity. I think that would be a key part of this. And when you're talking about a families plan, if something we've talked about here, Kevin, is the Opportunity Project, which is really about a way of getting people back into the workforce to where they have an earned permanent self-sufficiency, not government dependency, a self-sufficiency. And that allows for us to have a more productive economy, but more importantly, it helps for people to help their families the most.
Right. And pardon the interjection, and just for clarity, that kind of approach doesn't disallow all of us coming together through our private donations and even using some of our tax money to provide true safety net programs. But what we're doing with the one bill after another by the Biden administration and their allies in Congress is just worsening the problem, right?
That's right.
Of dependency, of debt that we're all going to have to pay for.
Exactly.
We've gotten the first question come in from the audience, and it's for both of you, but I'm going to pitch it to you first, Ken. And this audience member asks, on both of the issues you're focusing on, the economy and the border crisis, what will happen over the next 90 days? In other words, I think this audience member is asking, is it going to get worse before it gets better?
It looks like it's getting worse because the administration, although they see the polling that the public is holding the administration accountable for what's going on. We see that in the polling. 82% of Texans say we have a crisis on our border. It's the number one issue of concern right now in the state and throughout the country. It's increasingly, the president has to realize that his policies are disastrous for him politically as well and for his party. But most of all for the country and for our communities, they're not working. They're going to face increasing pressure from communities throughout the country, from people calling their elected officials to account for this, because I think they're going to see the effect of these policies just really force them to change course.
Vance, thanks, Ken. Vance, same question. Is the economic situation going to get worse before it gets better?
I think it will get worse. I think there will be higher levels of inflation that we'll see out there. The unemployment situation, I don't think will improve much as fast as what it should, given that there are 7 million jobs, 7 million people that are unemployed compared to where they were just last February. We've got some major problems going on, and this increased dependency on the federal government for not only families, but also states. And state sovereignty, I think, is a big issue moving forward.
In fact, it's a great transition to this next question from the audience member. Let me make sure that I read this one correctly. We'll pitch this one to you, Vance. What should state governments do first to resist federal overreach?
Well, fight back where you can.
What does that look like?
Well, I think already we've seen a number of lawsuits against the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA is what we call it. There was some amount that was sent out to states that was quote unquote flexible funding, but it had lines in there giving you restrictions, not for direct or indirect tax relief for the next 4 years. You couldn't provide it for, you couldn't use it for pension funds either. And the indirect or direct tax relief is the one where a lot of states have started to push back. And Ohio, I think, had a really good court opinion here recently that said there might be something there that could then end up sending this to the Supreme Court, because they are holding the hands, chaining the hands basically of a lot of these states to make decisions that are going to be best for those individual states. Because states should really be looking at cutting taxes, providing tax relief, not spending every one of these dollars that's coming in. And if you can't do that, it's putting us in a less competitive position for people to have jobs.
Right. So to come full circle on some of the economic data and even principles that you've articulated well today, while Texas would prefer not to have this money coming to us because it's, I mean, think of how inefficient it's going from the taxpayers to the federal treasury back to the state of Texas. If you're going to send Texas this money, federal government, we would argue that you use it for tax relief. Well, Congress has said you can't do that.
That's right.
Terrible problem.
Yes.
So, Ken, we're going to come to you next and ask you a question from a member of the audience. And it looks like this person is looking for a reliable source of news on the border crisis. Might be a complaint about some skewed news outlets out there. Are there written TV, radio, for that matter, podcast sources of news on your issue of immigration that this audience member could find?
I would just recommend to see a broad range of news outlets across the spectrum. Even in the liberal media outlets, you will sometimes get unwitting information that actually is very helpful to our cause for emphasizing border security must be the essential foundation for any change to our immigration system. The American people are losing confidence in the trustworthiness of our immigration law enforcement system. The current administration is responsible for that. But you really need to see a broad spectrum of media outlets, I believe.
Yeah, that's good advice. So we have time for a couple of other questions, and then we'll come to each of you for some closing comments. You have an inkling of what that question will be. You're smiling. That's good, because it'll be about optimism. But Vance, we'll pitch this question to you from an audience member who asks, how do you practically cut down the welfare state going forward? In other words, how do you reform the welfare state?
It's a great question. It's one that's been talked about and discussed for a number of years in Congress and elsewhere. I think we really need a different approach, especially from the more conservative side of the table, is to think about, it's not about that we're trying to get people off of welfare or anything else. I think you said this correctly a minute ago. It's about using scarce taxpayer dollars more wisely to help to go to those people that it's intended so that they can earn permanent self-sufficiency, right? And I think for too long, we've talked about, well, how can we eliminate it and get off of there? And I think maybe of a longer term goal, we want civil society to be as prosperous as possible so they can help them to get to that state, but we're not quite there. And so how can we start to go into these different programs in a practical way to allow for it to help those people it's intended? Too often it's going to bureaucracy. Too often it's going to those people who are not intended to get these programs. And so I think that's something that's got to be a first step to getting us back onto a path of sanity for these programs that will actually help people instead of hurting people along the way.
That's right. In fact, we've even seen, whether from the federal government or state governments, or as we know well here in the city of Austin, local governments, they're actually getting in the way of some nonprofit providers, whether it be about poverty. Last week, we talked about the issue of homelessness here in Austin. We're talking about government getting out of the way. We're not talking about government being uninvolved. We're talking about stripping away the regulations, the overspending, so that virtuous people, that would be most Americans, almost all Americans, will take action on behalf of their brothers and sisters. That's the aspirational vision for reforming the welfare state. Similar kind of question for you, Ken, from a member of the audience. They're intrigued by the Texas Public Policy Foundation's proposed solutions for the current crisis at the border, but they're also intrigued by what we think solving the immigration problems would be generally. So let's just say, in other words, we weather the current crisis, we get to a point where we have an administration and a Congress that will give Ken Oliver a magic wand for solving the immigration problem. What does that look like?
Well, we were heading in that direction up until just a few months ago, and we were securing the border first. We were getting apprehensions way down. The metrics, which we are studying at the TPPF, we're looking at metrics of apprehensions of gotaways going way down. And the border wall was being constructed, which was preventing illegal immigration and drugs and all kinds of bad things coming across. So we need to restore that agenda first. And we also need to restore the migrant protection protocols to stop people and get Mexico to cooperate on that, which is people cannot just be caught and released into the country. This is an unending problem if we continue down that road. So ideally, we're going to return to these policies that we had just a few months ago, and then we'll get border security at a point where people can be confident that it's working, and then deal with the people who are here, beginning with DACA and other populations that we need to consider.
And so the point is that a couple of others of you have asked, well, what role will organizations like our foundation and similar organizations play in a solution? We talk about the problems, we diagnose, we analyze the problems, as we like to say here, reading reality truthfully, so that we know which solutions to offer. The political situation is very difficult right now in Washington, D.C., and that's a bipartisan critique, right? Mm-hmm. We need both parties to actually be spending time fixing the problems that are real problems. All of that to say, gentlemen, we like to close these broadcasts by asking our guests, as our audience knows well, a question about optimism. And so, Ken Oliver, why did you wake up this morning, in spite of all of the failures of Biden's first 100 days, optimistic about the future of America?
Well, I still know we have so many people with their head on straight in this country. They did not vote for these policies that have destroyed our border security system were not on the table really in the election. Unfortunately, they're taking place, and by a small minority pushing that, I think, to the detriment of the party in power, both in Congress and the White House. So I'm optimistic that as we begin to see polling shifting our way on this issue of border security and immigration, that will, the American people will have the final say.
Excellent. Vance Ginn, you've got no shortage of optimism. What about you?
Well, I think it goes along with what Ken was saying. I believe strongly in the human spirit of Americans, mm-hmm. and their willingness to work and the dignity of work. And even with all these challenges that may be pushed back from these policies, that they're going to keep fighting back. And that's the beauty of our system of federalism, this laboratory of competition, where you have states like Texas, who are going to be continuing to lead the way of these pro-growth initiatives that really do help families, mm-hmm. because they can come in and help out themselves. And with that sort of situation going on among the greatest country known to man, that we will overcome this, and that human spirit and that animal spirit among people will overcome these challenges along the way.
Always. The human spirit always overcomes government overreach. Sometimes it gets ugly. Hopefully it doesn't get much uglier. Yeah. As a historian, I can think of some examples we don't want repeated. And I don't think we are. To answer my own question, I'm optimistic about the future of America because I get to work with you two guys and the many others here in this organization across the country, working on solutions, telling the truth about the problems, fixing them, let's hope. But also, most importantly, because of you, because of people in the audience who wake up each day, going to work, as Vance likes to say, building civil society in our associations, in our churches, our organizations. That's how we're going to weather this crisis, with people like you getting up and being Americans. Well, Ken Oliver, Dr. Vance Ginn, I can't thank you enough for joining me. It's nice to sit here on the stage in downtown Austin, no masks, no vaccine passports, not worried about what some government official might be saying or not saying. I won't even mention a certain government official who comes to mind about that. But the point is, we are going to weather this. We're going to get the economy fixed. We'll probably have to weather some poor data over the next few months. We are going to have to weather some data at the border that will not be good, but we will eventually get there because the American people understand that we have to fix these problems. For all of you in the audience, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. Take care.